We're going to have key concept 8.3.1. It's all about demographic and economic changes that happened after World War II up until the year 1980. So basically a very thematic approach to specific things that are going on within this historical period. Remember, this is something that we really touch on as we get through every period, dealing with immigration and dealing with migration and how those changes are happening domestically inside the country itself. So here we go. All right, so the first thing to know is kind of how the economy was developing beginning in the 1950s, after World War II, all the way up through this time period, about through the 1970s. What you need to know here is that there's changes in where kind of the demographics were in terms of age, and also the governmental changes in how they were approaching spending. In that line, there's something called the military-industrial complex. I've mentioned it before. It kept the U.S. economy strong during the Cold War era. Basically what this means is the federal government is looking to fund certain industries, so industries that were often developing new technology used for Cold War purposes, but these kinds of technology were being developed in the private sector. So basically the government is spending money, but it's spending money on things that are giving jobs to people not working for the government, but working for a corporation instead. So basically this is what we call a subsidy, the government giving money to companies instead of taxing companies to encourage certain industries to grow. Among these were defense industries, aviation, and a lot of things dealing with the Cold War and our military concerns around the world. Big ones like these, some are centered in San Diego, so big aeronautical companies like Northrop Grumman and Boeing, major companies that are going to help develop along with the space race as well. So NASA and trying to get into space, get a man on the moon, all this goes right in line with the military-industrial complex. Yes, the government's doing it, but they're spending money on technology outside of government as well. Okay? The place the space race comes from is we were really shocked when the Soviet Union was the first nation to get a satellite up into space. And anymore, we take this for granted because we rely on satellites for so much, even GPS on our phones, everything. All that Sputnik was is it wasn't so much a communication satellite or anything useful. It was just, did they have the technology to get a satellite into orbit? Just to get something into orbit is very difficult with very specific calculations. Soviet Union got there first, and this results in the government funding math and science education a lot more during this time period because there was this feeling that how did they beat us to having this huge technological feat? Okay? Now, because the military-industrial complex is going on, corporations do have a lot more money, but if you remember, for this long time we've had a trend of mechanization of labor. So that means that robots and machines are doing jobs that factory workers used to have to do. That means people who used to work with manual labor in factories, usually with higher paying jobs, are now in the service sector. So basically dealing with people rather than dealing with the actual goods or machinery. So kind of labor instead of resources. Does that make sense? So they're not actually making the things. Those are being made overseas. But they're working on how to sell those, on how to market them, on all these things that we think of as regular office jobs today. Okay, so I talked about that in the one about the 1970s and how it saw, because there was this decline in industrial sectors, the economy eventually kind of came to this head in 1970s where it was affecting it in a negative way. So other things that are really kind of growing our economy and technology is the 1950s saw the growth of an interstate highway system. So there's a map of it on the right. This is really Dwight D. Eisenhower's legacy as president of having the federal government build 42,000 miles of highway. Now, dealing with this is that it's much more common for people to have cars to be driving places rather than to be using trains or boats and other old means of transport, kind of personal transport instead of mass transit. Because people are traveling all over the country now with this interstate highway system, there's a growth of a consumer kind of industry dealing with hotels and restaurants, including fast food. So it's the 1950s where things like McDonald's and stuff really start to grow because there is a consumer-oriented industry based on getting things quick, on traveling, and having the same thing available all over the country. All right, something else that's mentioned on the left is the baby boom, which is going to have a big influence on family life. So the baby boom was a huge increase in birth rate, a drop in the divorce rate. Basically, after World War II, families wanted normalcy. They wanted to return to this time period where they weren't worried about war, they weren't worried about their families dying, they were at home, working, raising the kids, doing things that weren't sort of drastic and weren't sort of traumatic in their lives. Much like in the 1920s, how there was a response to how that was going on in World War I. Now, there's this increase in the number of babies, and meanwhile, there's also advances in medicine. So a polio vaccine comes along. So that means that basically before there was this deadly disease that might cripple children. I mean, it happened to FDR as an adult as well. Now the vaccine is there, so the disease no longer exists. Okay? Culture during this time period was increasingly focused on raising children. So television, marketing, things being offered to buy and sell were all focused around raising children, books and movies and songs. All this stuff because of this baby boom, this huge increase in what the target population of corporations were. They knew there was money to be made with raising children. All right, we'll talk about this a bit later too. Oops, what's going on here? Sorry, guys. All right, so going along with this is the growth of the middle class. I mentioned social mobility and migration in the suburbs and the Sun Belt. We'll talk about all those things. So, after World War II, something that contributed to the growth of the middle class had to do with the ability for veterans from World War II to go to college paid for by the federal government. This was called the GI Bill of Rights, and it was the idea of you served your country. In the past, the government, once you were sort of out of war, you didn't have a connection with the government anymore. But the government knew that if it wanted to remake the country after war, it needed to make sure the middle class could go through college attendance and education for veterans. Okay, so this built up the middle class because there was a large number of educated male breadwinners for the family while the wives are staying at home raising the children. So it also contributes to this kind of stereotypical image of the nuclear family back in the 1950s. Going along with the same image and the middle class were the suburbs. So this was meaning no longer living in an urban setting, but a suburban setting. So you have the city, but there's this sprawl outside the city that's mostly residential. So people would live out there and still commute to the city for work every day. We see 25 million homes were bought within this time period, and the best thing that's representative of this was mass-produced houses like a place called Levittown. This was the first tract housing. It was cheap to construct. It had like 3 or 4 set plans of houses. This is still how houses are made today in new neighborhoods. If you ever see a new neighborhood being built and you kind of walk through, you can see that all the houses are at different stages of being made, but because that, you can see how they're made. With Levittown, they could make about 30 houses in a day, when before architects weren't even producing 30 houses in a year. So this is a huge increase because that demand exists and because they wanted to fill that demand. The guy that created this, Bill Levitt, became one of the richest men in America because of his mass-produced houses that appealed to so many people now entering the middle class through the GI Bill of Rights. Now, something about these housing markets, though, is racial segregation was still there. Now, even though the Supreme Court said that companies could not do this, something called de facto segregation still happened, where it wasn't so much that companies were saying, we're denying you this house because you're black, but there was kind of pressure on black people not to move into neighborhoods where they knew they would face racism and prejudice anyway. All right, so the government also helped people get loans so they could buy a house with very little money down, which meant that they didn't have to have a lot of money in order to buy the house in the first place. You could pay it off over time, and the government was going to subsidize that a little bit to encourage the growth of the middle class. So by 1960, 1/3 of Americans live in the suburbs. Notice these are still connected to the cities. The highway system helped to create that. Remember, in the 1920s, we get to the point where half of Americans, or over half of Americans, were now living in urban settings. By the time we get to 1960, there's a shift from urban to suburban. So notice that it went from rural-dominated, urban-dominated, now to suburban-dominated. That's kind of the trends in where people are living in demographics. Okay, a lot of people are also moving to places called the Sun Belt. So this is California, the Southwest, so Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, even down into the South as we think of it as the actual South. Now, the reason a lot of people moved here was, of course, West Coast, best coast for California, I'm just saying. But also the climate is better, and a lot of jobs were available there after World War II. So many industries dealing with that military-industrial complex were opening down there, which meant that populations were increasingly moving there. Now, as people were moving to these places, into the suburbs, into the Sun Belt, this meant that many urban centers were losing their populations where whites had formerly lived. So these would have been sort of if we think the whole separate but equal system, these would have been the places with better amenities. And so as the whites left, blacks and other races started to move in and said, this is a great opportunity for us to now live in, the nice neighborhood, for us to have kind of a leg up in society. But what actually happened was, because a lot of those businesses left with these white populations, we also call it white flight, it actually didn't increase really anything for marginalized groups. It just meant that urban settings now became associated with minorities and sort of with urban decay as well, because a lot of the money had actually left the urban settings. So not just African Americans are moving in there, but immigrants as well. So Chinese immigrants, Mexican immigrants, Puerto Rican immigrants, Cuban immigrants as well are moving into the cities as white flight occurs to the suburbs. All right, one last slide here, and it's a very focused one. It's very focused, and it focuses on something that we've studied before, immigration. Notice we keep on checking in as how immigration is changing over the years. Now, in 1965, there was a major shift in immigration policy. So let's go here. So it was called the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. It fit in with LBJ's Great Society program with all these new laws that he was trying to get passed with Congress. So it changed the policies that had existed since the 1920s. If you remember, that was the National Origins Act. So that limited individual countries. It said based on a certain census date, only 2 or 3% of people of that nationality were able to come per year. It kind of rigged the system for immigrants, so it favored Western Europe and disadvantaged pretty much every other country for immigration. Now in 1965, there's going to be a shift. So the new rules is that for immigration each year, 120,000 immigrants can come to the U.S. legally from the Western Hemisphere and 170,000 per year from the Eastern Hemisphere. It also allowed for something called chain immigration. So if you got sort of immigration documents for you, your family members didn't count towards that quota right above where it says chain immigration. So that meant that it was really much larger numbers than those quotas set for the Western Eastern Hemisphere really reflected. It also gave preference to immigrants that had economic skill sets, so professional backgrounds, doctors, skilled workers, not people who were just would be doing manual labor or service sector labor. So basically, your application would go to the top if you had training, if you had education. Now, what we see here is some shifts in immigration because of this. Now, it allowed 3 times as many immigrants in the same amount of time. So think of this. From 1935 to 1965, 3 million people came to the U.S. legal from immigration. 1965 to 1985, 18 million people. So we saw a huge increase in the number, but there's also a shift in the types of immigrants. So not really European immigrants anymore, because Europe is either Western dominated and kind of democratically capitalist influenced in the West, or Soviet influence in the East. So many people weren't trying to leave, and those who wanted to leave Eastern Europe weren't able to. So what we see is a lot more immigration from Latin America and Asia due to these laws. You can see that in the chart on the right. If you see it at that very low point, that's basically 1965 there, right in the middle. Let me move this thing over here. So 1965 is right about here. And then the new law comes into place, and you can see there's a huge expansion of immigration. European immigration, this gray area at the bottom, doesn't really change, but a huge new amount of Asian immigration, Latin American immigration, but not really much African immigration. So really what you need to see here is, because of this law, it shifts our demographics, and this is going to cause some more nativist issues getting passed into the 1980s, which we will study in period 9. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. You know what to do next. Some note cards, your quiz, geography, chronology, and our next up and last video for period 8 if you're ready to go. So this is Mr. Chodola signing off. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in class. Bye.